Heavy needs help. Not because it's unplayable or because it's a bad class, but because I genuinely think it's one of the most confused classes in Space Marine 2. So today we're going to talk about why Heavy feels like it's missing its purpose, what Saber could improve upon with the upcoming gameplay updates, and why I think the class deserves some kind of perk tweaks down the line. I'm qbae, and let's get into it. Before we jump into today's video, I just wanted to say thank you. The support on my last video honestly just caught me completely off guard. I never expected it to reach so many people, and seeing all the views, the likes, and especially the comments was kinda generally overwhelming for me. More than anything, I really enjoyed reading through all your feedback and having conversation with you in the comments. Whether you agree with me or challenge my opinions, or even just sharing your own experiences, it was awesome to see so many people who are just as passionate about Space Marine 2 as I am. So if you watched the last video, left a comment or liked it, or even if you just stopped by to check it out, thank you so much. I really appreciate every bit of support you guys show this channel, and with that out of the way, let's talk about Heavy. According to Saber, Heavy, Tactical, and Vanguard are all receiving gameplay updates in the future patch. We already know that these changes have most likely slipped into year 3, so unfortunately we'll have to wait a little longer. But that gives us plenty of time to discuss what actually needs to change. Now, if you watched this channel before, you already know I'm incredibly biased when it comes to Heavy. It's my favorite class in the game, and that's exactly why I think it's worth criticizing. Because despite being fun to play, I don't think Heavy currently has a clear identity. Today I want to go over what Heavy is lacking, why its perk tree doesn't support the fantasy of the class, and what I like to see Saber change in upcoming gameplay updates. Heavy is supposed to be the dedicated range class in the game. It's the only class in the game that actually completely commits to its primary weapon. There's no melee weapon to fall back on, and your primary weapon basically is your whole identity. And that raises the question, what does Heavy actually gain in exchange for giving up its melee weapon? Bulwark, for example, makes the exact opposite sacrifice. It gives up its primary weapon slot, but in return it receives, in my opinion, the most broken ability in the game, which is the Storm Shield. The shield completely defines the class. It allows Bulwark to completely ignore range damage and survive every situation no other class can. It also is able to animation cancel all of his attacks, and the Storm Shield is the main reason why you pretty much can just stun lock a Carnifex or any other boss into oblivion, but just by canceling your own shield bash as soon as the damage hits. I don't want to start ranting about Bulwark being the most overpowered class in the game, but this trade-off makes sense. You lose ranged combat, but you become the king of defensive play. Heavy doesn't really have an equivalent payoff for that. Instead of a melee weapon, it gets heavy stance and oversized versions of existing weapons all other classes have access to. The problem is that heavy stance isn't some unique mechanic that fundamentally changes the class. It's simply how your weapon functions. Iron Halo helps against range attacks, but it doesn't solve the weakness that comes from not having a melee weapon. When enemies surround you, your answer is basically stomp and hope you can create enough space to keep shooting. That doesn't feel like an equivalent exchange for losing a melee weapon. Heavy sacrifices one of the game's core combat systems, but doesn't receive a defining mechanic that completely changes how it approaches combat. But what if Heavy simply got a melee weapon? Personally, I don't think that's the answer. First of all, the only weapon that would really make sense here would be the combat knife, and Saber would have to redesign the whole class. Heavy currently carries its primary weapon on the right arm, and that one is also attached to the power plant, so you can't really just remove that one. Giving it a melee weapon would just require a complete reworking of how the class carries and swaps weapons, and I just don't see that from happening. Gameplay wise, it also wouldn't solve that much in my opinion. As I said, Heavy already has Stomp for crowd control, and the combat knife isn't particularly strong at clearing hordes anyway. It's more of a single target damage tool. The biggest benefit that a melee weapon would be for Heavy is maybe giving him access to different parry windows instead of the weapon dependent ones we currently have. But I think this was a clear design choice, and Saber's not going to change this one. And I also don't think Heavy should lean into becoming a melee class. I think Heavy should become an even better ranged class. That also becomes clear when we start looking at the Heavy's perk tree. One of my biggest issues is just how one-dimensional it feels. When you look at the hardest content in the game, there are really only one or two perk setups that you see consistently used. If you've played or not Absolute for yourself, you've probably seen almost every Heavy running one of these builds. That's a problem. A good perk tree should encourage experimentation and allow players to build their own class in a different way. Heavy's perk tree doesn't really do that. Instead, it presents a handful of mandatory choices with a lot of filler perks in between. And that's really where my second criticism begins. A lot of these filler perks don't actually make Heavy better at doing what Heavy is supposed to do. Instead of, they are incredibly situational or only become useful when something has already gone wrong. Take Bonds of Brotherhood, for example. I understand the intention behind the perk, but I don't think this kind of design belongs on the Heavy. If Saber wants a class that specializes in reviving teammates or bringing people back at full health, I would much rather see these attached to a future apothecary. Heavy should be about overwhelming firepower, not emergency medical support. That just doesn't fit his design choice. The biggest issue is that perks like these only become active when your team has already failed. If nobody goes down during your operation, the perk effectively doesn't exist for you. You're spending one of your class perk slots on something that never really impacted your gameplay in the first place. The same applies to the perk that prevents your weapon from overheating when you're the last player alive. We are almost 2 years into Space Marine 2's life, and I've never seen anyone intentionally build around this perk. Because, just like Bonds of Brotherhood, it only becomes valuable once your entire team has already been wiped out. And that's not interesting gameplay, it's a safety net for losing. And personally, I don't think class perks should be designed around rewarding failure. They should reward good positioning and good decision making. Heavy's perks should make me a better heavy while the mission is actually going on, not only when everyone else has already fallen apart. Then there are perks that aren't necessarily useless but simply don't make much sense. One example is the perk that increases your damage while your weapon is overheated. On paper it sounds interesting, and in reality the damage increase is so small that it doesn't even change meaningful breakpoints. But the biggest problem is actually that it actively fights against other perks in your class tree. Heavy also has access to perks like Perfect Cooling, which instantly cools your weapon after perfect dodge. So one perk encourages you to keep your weapon overheated, while another one rewards you for cooling it immediately. Those perks don't complement each other and they contradict each other directly. I don't think that this is something we could call build diversity. I think it's more like poor perk synergy. On top of that, many perks don't even reinforce the class fantasy in the first place. Heavy isn't designed around engaging enemies in melee. That's the whole reason it doesn't have a dedicated melee weapon in the first place. So, why do we find perk nodes in both the class tree and the weapon class tree that reward melee combat? Nobody's gonna pick Heavy because they want stronger melee attacks. They pick Heavy because they just want to carry the biggest weapon and just keep shooting. Those perk points would be much better spent enhancing something like his primary weapon, or expanding Heavy stance, or giving his Iron Halo more meaningful interactions. Every perk should reinforce the class fantasy in the first place, instead of trying to pull it into a completely different direction. And that brings me what I think is the biggest issue with Heavy's current design. The class no longer has a clear identity. More importantly, Saber needs to create clearer separations between ranged classes. Right now, the line between heavy and tactical has become far too blurry in my opinion. This becomes even more obvious when we compare the two directly. Both classes compete for the exact same role. They're both supposed to be the squad's primary source of range damage. The big problem is, tactical simply does the job better. His perk tree is built around improving his weapon's performance, and everything naturally synergizes to one extent. Damage buffs stacked together and ammo economy is honestly just incredible. And on top of that, it still brings valuable utility to the rest of the team. Heavy doesn't really have the same level of synergy. Most of its strength come from the weapon themselves rather than the class or its perk tree. For example, let's look at the Plasma Incinerator. You would expect Heavy's version to clearly outperform Tacticals. After all, we as the Heavy had to sacrifice our entire melee weapon to carry it. Instead, Tactical can invest into Plasma Boost and reach almost the exact same breakpoints to incapacitate a Majora's enemy. If Tactical reaches almost the same breakpoints while also bringing better utility and better ammo economy, why would we choose the Heavy in the first place? Tactical has access to Emperor's Vengeance, which is arguably the strongest ammo regeneration perk in the game. As long as you're consistently executing Majora's enemies, or you can practically ignore ammo management for the rest of the operation. Meanwhile, Heavy often struggles with ammo despite literally being designed to just shoot his primary weapon. Its ammo regeneration depends on executing extremist enemies due to its prestige perk. Those enemies appear a lot in Absolute, but in public lobbies everyone is usually trying to secure those executions for themselves. So in the end, somehow the class whose entire identity revolves around carrying the biggest guns and shooting the whole time is worrying about ammo economy. To me, that feels completely backwards. Heavy doesn't necessarily need to outdamage tactical in every situation, but if it's going to sacrifice his entire melee weapon slot and dedicate itself exclusively to range combat, then I think it should have something that clearly separates it from other range classes. Right now, Tactical just competes with Heavy in its own niche while offering more flexibility, stronger team utility, and a perk tree that better supports itself in its intended role. That's the real problem, I think. Heavy isn't weak, Heavy has no role that truly belongs to it. At the end of the day, this is just my perspective as someone who put a lot of time into Heavy. I don't think Heavy is a bad class, and I still really much enjoy playing it. I just think it has the potential to be so much more. With Saber already confirming that gameplay updates are coming, I really hope they just don't adjust a few numbers. I hope they take this opportunity to give Heavy a clear identity and a perk tree that actually supports the fantasy of being the primal range damage dealer. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear you guys' thoughts. Do you think Heavy is in a good spot right now, or do you agree that it needs a bigger redesign? If you could change one thing about the class, what would it be? I would genuinely love to read your ideas, so leave them down in the comments and let's have a discussion about it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more Space Marine 2 content like this, I really appreciate if you would subscribe. The support on my last video was honestly incredible, and seeing this little community continue to grow has been really amazing. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I've been qbae, and I will see you in the next one.